"Oh, she's not family," my daughter-in-law said with a pleasant smile as the grocery clerk scanned our cart. "She's our maid. She helps around the house." I looked at the young cashier, whose smile faded just enough for me to notice, then back at the woman I had welcomed into my family 12 years earlier. I didn't argue. I didn't correct her. I simply folded my hands around the shopping cart and smiled as though I hadn't heard a single word. That was the moment I realized I had been disappearing from my own family long before that Saturday morning. My name is Margaret Collins. I'm 68 years old, and until my husband passed away 4 years ago, I believed our family had been built on respect instead of convenience. My late husband, Robert, used to tell me that the strongest homes were held together by kindness, not money. I repeated those words to myself almost every day after he was gone. They became something to hold on to whenever the silence inside my little townhouse felt too heavy. After Robert's funeral, my son Daniel insisted I spend more time with his family. He said the grandchildren needed their grandmother, and that the house always felt warmer whenever I visited. I believed him. I wanted to believe him. So I filled my weeks with school pickups, homemade dinners, birthday cakes, science fair projects, and afternoons spent folding tiny socks that somehow always disappeared before the next load of laundry. I never kept track of the hours because love was never something I measured with a clock. Ashley often said she was overwhelmed with work, appointments, and endless errands. Whenever she called, I answered. Whenever she needed help, I came. Some weeks I spent more time in their kitchen than in my own. I stocked their pantry, clipped grocery coupons, polished fingerprints from little windows, and quietly replaced worn-out towels without telling anyone. I thought that was what mothers did. I thought that was what family meant. That Saturday had started like dozens before it. Ashley suggested we stop at the grocery store after picking up supplies for my grandson's school project. She pushed the cart while I compared prices on canned soup and searched for the apples my granddaughter liked best. We joked about a recipe I wanted to try, and for a little while everything felt almost ordinary. Then we reached the checkout lane. The cashier smiled politely and asked whether we had found everything we needed. Before I could answer, Ashley laughed lightly and said the sentence that seemed to freeze the air around us. "She's our maid. She knows where everything is better than I do." Her voice carried just enough for the people behind us to hear. A man loading bottled water glanced in my direction before quickly looking away. The cashier hesitated for a heartbeat, then forced another smile and continued scanning the groceries. No one said anything else. I reached into my purse, removed the envelope containing the grocery money I had quietly contributed every week for nearly 3 years, and handed Ashley the cash without saying a word. She accepted it as naturally as someone accepting the weather. As we walked toward the parking lot beneath the bright spring sunshine, she chatted about dinner plans and weekend sales as though nothing unusual had happened. I listened in silence, but somewhere deep inside me, a door closed with a quiet certainty that even I could not ignore. The drive home felt strangely quiet, although Ashley filled every mile with cheerful conversation about discount coupons, soccer practice, and a new patio set she wanted Daniel to buy before summer. I answered only when politeness required it. My mind stayed inside that checkout lane, replaying her words with painful clarity. The sentence itself had lasted only a few seconds, yet it somehow managed to erase years of birthday parties, holiday dinners, scraped knees I had comforted, and evenings spent reading bedtime stories until my voice became hoarse. By the time we pulled into their driveway, I realized something that frightened me more than the embarrassment itself. Ashley had spoken those words too naturally. There had been no hesitation, no nervous laugh, no glance toward me to see whether I might object. It had sounded practiced, almost ordinary, as though she had already introduced me that way before. I helped carry the grocery bags into the kitchen exactly as I always did. Fresh vegetables went into the refrigerator. Pantry items found their usual shelves. The milk was placed behind the orange juice because my granddaughter always reached for the juice first. My hands moved automatically through routines I knew better than my own. Ashley thanked me without looking up from her phone. 10 minutes later she left for a hair appointment, reminding me that the children would be home from school at 3 o'clock. She did not ask whether I had other plans. She simply assumed I would stay. The truth was I had not made plans for myself in years. My calendar revolved around theirs. Mondays were piano lessons. Tuesdays were baseball practice. Wednesdays meant grocery shopping. Thursdays were laundry because everyone needed clean clothes before the weekend. Fridays usually ended with pizza night, which I prepared from scratch because the grandchildren liked my homemade crust better than takeout. Somewhere along the way I had quietly become the person who made everything run smoothly while asking for almost nothing in return. As I folded clean towels that afternoon, I noticed details I had ignored for months. Family photographs covered the hallway walls. Daniel and Ashley smiled from vacations in Florida, ski trips to Colorado, and beach weekends along the Carolina coast. The children appeared in every season of their young lives. I was in surprisingly few of those pictures. When I did appear, I was usually standing behind everyone else, holding a diaper bag, pushing a stroller, or carrying jackets. I could not remember the last photograph where someone had asked me to stand in the center. It was a small realization, but it settled heavily in my heart. Perhaps disappearing had not begun at the grocery store after all. Perhaps it had started one polite compromise at a time. Daniel came home shortly after 6 o'clock, tired from work but smiling as the children ran to greet him. Ashley kissed him on the cheek and laughed about something she had seen online. I watched them from the kitchen sink while washing dinner dishes. Daniel thanked Ashley for picking up groceries, even though I had selected most of them and quietly paid for nearly half. Neither of them mentioned the checkout line. Neither of them noticed the silence that had settled inside me. I dried my hands carefully, looked around the warm kitchen I had helped keep together for so many years, and understood that the hardest truths rarely arrive all at once. They reveal themselves through ordinary moments until one day you finally see the pattern that had been waiting for you all along. 3 days passed, and life continued with the same comfortable rhythm that had once made me feel needed, but now only made me feel invisible. Every morning I arrived before 8 o'clock with a fresh loaf of bread or a container of homemade soup, and every evening I left after the dinner dishes had been washed and the kitchen counters wiped clean. Nothing about my routine changed, but everything about the way I saw it did. Once you recognize a pattern, it becomes impossible to ignore. Small moments that had seemed harmless suddenly carried a different meaning. One afternoon I attended my granddaughter Lily's school art fair. She had begged me to come because she wanted to show me the watercolor painting she had spent 2 weeks finishing. I stood proudly beside her display while she explained every detail of the bluebird she had painted on an old oak tree. Another grandmother walked over with a warm smile and asked Ashley whether I was her mother. Before I could answer, Ashley laughed softly and replied, "Oh, Margaret just helps us with the children. We would never survive without her." The woman smiled politely, assuming I worked for the family in some professional capacity. Ashley never corrected the misunderstanding. Neither did Daniel, who had been standing only a few feet away discussing weekend plans with another parent. At the time I convinced myself it was nothing. Now I remembered the conversation word for word. A week later, during a neighborhood barbecue, one of Daniel's co-workers thanked me for taking such wonderful care of the Collins family. He complimented my cooking because Ashley had apparently told everyone that I prepared every holiday meal. I smiled and accepted the compliment, believing he simply appreciated my help. Looking back, I realized something important was missing. No one introduced me as Daniel's mother. No one said I was the grandmother who loved spending time with her family. Somehow my relationship to the people I loved had slowly been replaced by the work I performed for them. The realization settled over me like a cold autumn rain. It was not one terrible moment that had changed everything. It was dozens of quiet moments that had gone unchallenged, because I wanted peace more than recognition. Even the grandchildren had unknowingly begun following the example they saw every day. 8-year-old Lily still hugged me tightly whenever I arrived, but 6-year-old Ethan had started saying things that made my heart ache. "Grandma, Mommy says you know where everything goes because you are here all the time," he said one afternoon while I folded his baseball uniform. His voice carried only childhood innocence. There was no cruelty in his words, only acceptance of what he believed to be true. I kissed the top of his head and told him that helping people you love is a wonderful thing. But inside I wondered what lessons he was quietly absorbing from the adults around him. That evening, after everyone had gone to bed, I gathered my purse and prepared to leave. As I walked toward the front door, I noticed an envelope resting on the small hallway table beside a bowl of house keys. Ashley had left it partially open. Inside was a handwritten shopping list for the following week. At the bottom she had written, Have Margaret pick everything up on Wednesday. She knows what we need anyway. There was no please. There was no conversation about whether I might have plans of my own. It was simply another task assigned as naturally as replacing light bulbs or taking out the trash. I quietly placed the envelope exactly where I had found it, stepped outside into the cool evening air, and for the first time in many years drove home wondering whether the family I believed I was holding together had already decided that I belonged somewhere very different. The following Saturday I did something I had not done in years. I stayed home. My telephone rang. Twice before 9 o'clock. I watched the screen light up with Ashley's name, then quietly placed the phone back on the kitchen table without answering. 10 minutes later Daniel called. His message was cheerful at first. He assumed I had forgotten the time. Then another message arrived asking whether everything was all right, because the children were waiting for me. I listened to both recordings only after I had poured myself a second cup of coffee. It was the first peaceful Saturday morning I had enjoyed in a very long time. Sunlight spilled across my dining room floor, and the silence inside my townhouse no longer felt lonely. It felt honest. I opened the cedar chest that Robert had built during our 25th wedding anniversary. Inside were old photo albums, handwritten Christmas cards, and faded snapshots that carried the scent of another lifetime. I found a picture of Daniel at 8 years old standing proudly beside the bicycle Robert and I had saved months to buy. Another showed Daniel graduating from college with one arm around each of us, smiling as though nothing in the world mattered more than family. Then I found the photograph that stopped me completely. It had been taken the day Daniel introduced Ashley to us. Robert had whispered that evening, "She seems ambitious, but give her time. Every new family needs patience." Robert believed people deserved kindness before judgment. So did I. Looking back, I realized I had confused patience with surrender. Little compromises had slowly become expectations, and expectations had quietly become obligations. Around noon my doorbell rang. Daniel stood on my porch holding a paper bag from my favorite bakery. His smile looked uncertain. "Mom, everyone has been wondering where you are," he said as though my absence had been the unusual part of the morning. I invited him inside and placed 2 coffee mugs on the table. For several minutes we spoke about the weather, the children, and his work. The conversation drifted comfortably across safe subjects until he finally asked why I had not answered my telephone. I looked at my son for a long moment before speaking. "Daniel, when was the last time you came here just to see me instead of needing something?" The question lingered between us. He frowned slightly, searching for an answer that did not come easily. Instead he spoke about how busy life had become, how demanding work was, how much the children relied on my help. I nodded because every word was true, yet none of them answered my question. Before leaving, he thanked me for everything I did for the family. It was a kind sentence, but something about it sounded different now. He thanked me for what I did, not for who I was. After he drove away, I stood at the front window watching his truck disappear around the corner. I realized that love without respect eventually begins to resemble duty, and duty without appreciation slowly becomes invisible labor. I was no longer angry. Anger burns hot and disappears quickly. What remained inside me was something quieter and far more lasting. It was clarity. For the first time since Robert passed away, I understood that changing my own life would not begin with a confrontation. It would begin with a single decision to stop making myself available every time someone expected me to quietly carry a burden that had never truly been mine. Monday morning arrived with the familiar expectation that I would appear at their front door before breakfast, but instead I drove to the public library, renewed my library card, and checked out 3 novels I had been meaning to read for years. It felt strangely unfamiliar to make a choice based entirely on what I wanted. Around 10 o'clock my telephone rang again. Ashley sounded rushed. She asked whether I could stop by because she had forgotten that Ethan needed cupcakes for a classroom celebration the next day. Normally I would have driven straight to the grocery store, purchased every ingredient, baked 2 dozen cupcakes and delivered them before bedtime. This time I answered calmly, "I am sorry, Ashley. I already have plans today." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "What kind of plans?" she asked. The question caught me by surprise. Not because it was rude, but because it revealed something neither of us had ever questioned before. My time had quietly become community. Property. Just plans for myself, I replied gently. She laughed as though I had made a small joke. Well, maybe afterward. I smiled even though she could not see me. No, not afterward either. When the call ended, I felt guilty for only a moment. Years of saying yes had trained my heart to confuse healthy boundaries with selfishness. By late afternoon, Daniel called. He sounded tired rather than angry. He explained that Ashley had needed to leave work early, the children had eaten frozen dinners, and nobody remembered the cupcakes until it was too late. I apologized that things had become stressful but did not apologize for staying home. There was another silence between us, one that neither of us seemed prepared to fill. The following morning I visited a small neighborhood cafe that Robert and I had loved before retirement. The owner recognized me immediately and insisted on serving my favorite cinnamon roll fresh from the oven. As I sat near the window with a cup of coffee, I realized how long it had been since someone had asked me what I wanted before asking what I could do. While I was enjoying the quiet, a familiar voice interrupted my thoughts. Mrs. Collins? I looked up and recognized Emma, the young grocery store cashier from Saturday. She smiled politely and asked whether she could sit for a minute during her break. We spoke about ordinary things at first. She mentioned college classes, long work hours, and how busy the store had become since summer shopping had started. Then her expression changed. She looked down at her coffee cup before speaking again. I have been thinking about you ever since last weekend, she said softly. I hope you do not mind me saying this, but something about that conversation at the checkout did not feel right. I thanked her for her kindness and assured her that I was doing well. Emma hesitated once more. I almost said something that day, she admitted. I knew she was not telling the truth. The way you looked at the children and the way they hugged you before you left, that was not how someone looks at an employee. That was family. Her words settled into my heart more deeply than she could have imagined. For the first time since everything had begun to change, someone outside my family had seen exactly what I had been trying so hard not to admit. I finished my coffee slowly, thanked Emma for her honesty, and walked back into the bright morning sunlight with an unexpected feeling growing inside me. It was not revenge. It was not resentment. It was the quiet comfort of knowing that even after months of being overlooked, there were still people who could recognize dignity when they saw it. The changes I made were so small that nobody noticed them at first. I did not announce new boundaries or deliver emotional speeches. I simply stopped stepping in before anyone asked. When the refrigerator at Daniel's house became nearly empty, I did not quietly refill it on my way over. When a basket of unfolded laundry sat in the hallway, I walked past it without reaching for a single towel. When the children forgot a permission slip for school, I let their parents solve the problem together. I was not punishing anyone. I was simply returning responsibilities to the people they belonged to. The first week felt awkward. Ashley sent short text messages asking whether I could quickly stop by for an hour, but an hour had always become 4. I answered politely that I already had commitments. Those commitments were sometimes a gardening class at the community center, sometimes lunch with an old church friend, and sometimes nothing more than reading a novel on my own back porch. For years I had believed my schedule needed to be filled with usefulness before it deserved respect. Now I was slowly learning that simply living my own life was reason enough. Daniel seemed confused more than upset. He called one evening while driving home from work and admitted that keeping up with the house had become harder than he expected. The children had missed one baseball practice because nobody remembered the equipment bag. They had ordered takeout 3 nights in 1 week because dinner plans kept falling apart. He laughed nervously while telling me the story, expecting me to offer my usual solution. Instead, I listened quietly and said, "It sounds like you both have a lot on your plates." He waited for more, but there was nothing else to add. Advice given too early is rarely heard. 2 days later, I received another call, this time from Lily. My sweet granddaughter wanted to know why I had not visited as often. I told her honestly that I loved spending time with her and Ethan, but I was also taking better care of myself. She accepted the explanation with the simple wisdom only children sometimes possess. "That makes sense," she said. "Mom says grown-ups need breaks too." Her innocent words made me smile because somewhere inside that busy house, an important lesson had quietly begun. That Saturday I visited the local farmers market instead of driving across town. Fresh flowers filled the sidewalks, musicians played old folk songs, and neighbors greeted one another without rushing. I bought a small bouquet of white daisies for my dining table, and a loaf of fresh sourdough bread that reminded me of the weekends Robert used to spend baking. As I reached for my wallet, I heard someone call my name. It was Michael Turner, the manager from the grocery store. He recognized me from my weekly visits and asked how I had been. We spoke pleasantly for a few minutes before he hesitated and lowered his voice. "I hope you do not mind me mentioning this," he said carefully, "but Emma felt terrible after what happened at the checkout. She told me about it because she thought you deserved better." I assured him that Emma had already shown me great kindness. Michael nodded thoughtfully. "Respect is something people should never have to earn twice," he replied. I carried those words home with me that afternoon. They stayed in my thoughts long after the flowers had been placed in water and the bread had been sliced for dinner. For so long I had measured love by everything I was willing to give away. Now I was beginning to understand that real love does not ask someone to disappear in order for everyone else to feel comfortable. The more I reclaimed small pieces of my own life, the more clearly I could see that the person returning was not someone new at all. She was the woman I had been before I convinced myself that being needed was the same thing as being valued. The following Sunday, Daniel invited me to dinner. His voice sounded unusually careful, as though he had rehearsed every sentence before calling. I accepted because I loved my son and my grandchildren, not because I expected anything to be different. As I drove toward their house, I reminded myself that I was no longer arriving to rescue anyone from forgotten errands or unfinished chores. I was simply a guest. Ashley opened the front door with a bright smile that did not quite reach her eyes. The kitchen looked unusually busy. Dishes covered the countertops, the dishwasher was still full of clean plates waiting to be put away, and the smell of something slightly overcooked drifted through the house. Months ago I would have slipped off my sweater, tied on an apron, and quietly restored order before anyone noticed. Instead I complimented the flowers on the dining table, and sat beside Lily, while she showed me a book she had borrowed from the school library. Ashley disappeared into the kitchen several times, each trip becoming a little more hurried than the last. Finally she leaned into the living room doorway and said, "Margaret, could you help me finish dinner?" I looked up from Lily's storybook and smiled gently. "I think you have everything under control." For a brief moment the room became completely still. Ashley blinked, clearly surprised by my answer. "It will only take a minute," she added with a strained laugh. "I appreciate that," I replied. "But today I came to spend time with my family." Daniel glanced from me to Ashley without saying a word. He had heard my answer, but I could tell he was still trying to understand why such a simple sentence carried so much weight. Dinner was eventually served, although later than planned. Nobody complained. The children happily talked about school projects and neighborhood friends, while the adults picked quietly at roasted chicken and mashed potatoes. Halfway through the meal Ashley sighed dramatically and said, "Everything has been so much harder lately. I never realized how much help we depended on." Her words floated across the table like an invitation for someone to solve the problem. I took a sip of iced tea but said nothing. Daniel looked thoughtful instead of sympathetic. "Maybe we all relied on Mom too much," he said quietly. Ashley immediately answered, "Well, she has always enjoyed helping." Before I could respond, Lily looked up from her plate with the honest curiosity only children possess. "Grandma, are you happier now?" she asked. The question caught everyone by surprise. I smiled warmly at her. "Yes, sweetheart. I am." She nodded as though the answer explained everything. "You laugh more now," she said before returning to her dinner. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Children often notice changes adults overlook because they pay attention without carrying assumptions. After dessert, Daniel walked me to my car. The evening air was cool, and the neighborhood was quiet except for sprinklers gently watering nearby lawns. He stood beside my car with his hands in his pockets. "Mom," he said slowly, "I keep feeling like I missed something important. I know you have changed, but I cannot figure out when it started." I looked at my son and realized he was asking an honest question, not defending anyone. "Sometimes," I answered softly, "people do not notice a bridge is wearing away because they cross it every day. Then one morning they wonder why it no longer feels safe." Daniel lowered his eyes without replying. As I drove home beneath the fading evening sky, I had the quiet feeling that for the first time in many years, my son had finally begun looking beyond everything I did for the family and had started seeing the woman who had been standing there all along. 2 mornings later, my telephone rang just after 9 o'clock. Daniel asked whether I would meet him for coffee before he went to the office. His voice carried none of the hurried confidence I had grown used to hearing. Instead, it sounded thoughtful, almost uncertain. We met at the same neighborhood cafe where Robert and I had spent countless Saturday mornings years before. Daniel arrived early, already seated by the window with 2 cups waiting on the table. For several minutes we talked about ordinary things: the changing weather, Lily's reading competition, Ethan's excitement about baseball season. Then he folded his hands together and looked directly at me. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly." I nodded. "Has Ashley been treating you differently for a long time?" I did not rush to answer. There was no anger left inside me, only a quiet desire to tell the truth without making anyone the villain of the story. "It did not happen all at once," I said gently. "Respect usually disappears one small moment at a time. You hardly notice it until one day you realize it is gone." Daniel lowered his eyes toward his untouched coffee. He admitted he had started remembering things after our conversation outside his house. Family parties where I spent the entire evening serving food instead of enjoying dinner. Holidays where I quietly cleaned the kitchen, while everyone else opened presents in the living room. School events where I stood in the background holding coats and bags while photographs were taken without me. "I saw all of those things," he whispered. "I just never really looked at them." Before I could respond, someone approached our table. It was Emma. She recognized us immediately and smiled politely before apologizing for interrupting. Daniel invited her to join us for a moment. Emma hesitated, then quietly explained that she had never forgotten what happened at the grocery store. She repeated Ashley's exact words with careful honesty, adding that several customers had looked uncomfortable because they believed I was being spoken about without dignity. Daniel's face became pale with regret. He thanked Emma sincerely for telling him the truth and apologized that she had been placed in such an awkward position. After she returned to work, neither of us spoke for almost a full minute. Finally, Daniel looked at me again. "Why did you never tell me?" he asked. I smiled softly because I had asked myself the same question many times. "I kept hoping someone would notice without me having to defend my own worth," I answered. "I believed family should never need to ask for basic respect." Daniel covered his face briefly with one hand before taking a slow breath. "I failed you," he said quietly. I reached across the table and rested my hand over his. "You made mistakes," I replied. "That is different from failing forever. What matters is what you choose after you finally see the truth." Later that evening, Daniel called and asked whether I would join the family for dinner the following weekend, because there were things everyone needed to discuss together. His tone carried a calm determination I had not heard in years. After we ended the call, I stood by my living room window watching the sun settle behind the trees outside my townhouse. I did not know exactly what would happen at that dinner, but I knew something important had already changed. The silence that had protected uncomfortable habits for so long had finally been broken, not by shouting or blame, but by simple truth spoken with dignity. Sometimes that is the strongest voice a family will ever hear. When I arrived for dinner that Saturday evening, the atmosphere felt different before anyone said a single word. Daniel greeted me at the front door with a warm embrace that lingered longer than usual. Lily and Ethan ran over to hug me, eager to show me drawings they had made during the week. Ashley welcomed me politely, but there was a nervousness in her smile that had not been there before. We gathered around the dining table, and for the first time in many years I noticed that my place had been set beside Daniel instead of at the far end where I usually found myself. It was a small gesture, but sometimes respect returns through quiet actions before it ever finds the right words. Dinner began with ordinary conversation, yet everyone seemed aware that something important remained unsaid. After the plates had been cleared, Daniel placed his napkin beside his plate and looked around the table. "There is something we need to talk about as a family," he said calmly. He turned toward Ashley first. "I met with Mom this week, and I also spoke with someone who witnessed what happened at the grocery store." Ashley's expression changed immediately. She tried to explain that it had only been a joke, and that she never meant to embarrass anyone. Daniel listened without interrupting. When she finished, he quietly replied, "A joke is only funny when everyone is laughing." Mom was not laughing. Neither was anyone else. The room became silent. Ashley lowered her eyes and folded her hands together. After several moments, she looked at me. "Margaret, I owe you an apology," she said softly. "I became so used to everything you did for us that I stopped seeing how much you were giving." I told myself those words did not matter, but I understand now that they did. "I am sorry for the way I spoke about you, and for the many times I failed to show you the respect you deserved." I thanked her for the apology because sincerity deserves acknowledgement, but I also answered honestly. "Forgiveness is something I can offer," I said gently. "Trust is something we rebuild together over time." Nobody argued with those words. Daniel nodded slowly, understanding exactly what they meant. The children watched us quietly, learning a lesson that could never be found in a textbook. Before I left that evening, Daniel walked me to my car once again. He promised that things would be different, not because he expected me to resume the role I had quietly carried for so many years, but because he finally understood the difference between gratitude and dependence. Over the following months, our family changed in simple but meaningful ways. I visited because I wanted to, not because someone expected me to solve every problem. Daniel and Ashley shared the responsibilities of their home. The grandchildren learned to help set the table and clean the kitchen after meals. On birthdays and holidays, I sat with everyone else instead of working behind the scenes. Family photographs finally included me standing beside my children instead of somewhere in the background. One bright Saturday morning, I returned to the same grocery store where everything had begun. Emma smiled the moment she recognized me. We chatted for a few minutes before Daniel and the children joined me near the checkout lane. Lily slipped her hand into mine and proudly looked at the cashier. "This is my grandma," she said with a wide smile. "She is the best baker in the whole world." Emma smiled warmly, and Daniel looked at me with quiet gratitude instead of expectation. As we walked into the sunshine carrying our groceries together, I realized that dignity is never something another person has the power to give or take away forever. Sometimes it simply waits patiently for us to remember that it has belonged to us all along.